Throughout Avatar: The Last Airbender's 65-episode run, it covers topics and themes like genocide, war, nationalism, and authoritarianism. It features discussions about philosophy and spirituality that are not merely aesthetic dressing, but fundamental to the core of its narrative. Despite being a children's show, these themes and ideas are not diluted in the name of accessibility, but are strengthened by their effortless universality. To put it another way, the show features a lot of heavy shit. Yet, Avatar's opening scene, its de facto narrative thesis statement, is about a pair of teenage siblings getting into a mild argument that is grounded enough in real-world emotions that this fight could be taking place in a suburban home in Middle America. A superficial glance at Avatar may cause someone to chalk up this seemingly insignificant opening as early show growing pains, a moment in time before the show grew the beard and came into its own. I disagree. This opening is Avatar: The Last Airbender. Everything the show wants to say is here, in this moment, dramatized through a childish argument that is forced to end as the grim reality of a world drowned in war looms large, with a terrible destiny forced upon children whose only qualifications are being victims to the circumstances they were born into. Avatar is so confident, so assured in what it is and what it wants to say that it can open in such a seemingly banal way. A more insecure show, knowing the dramatic heights Avatar would reach, would bombard the viewer with stimuli off the bat, afraid that should you let your foot off the gas for a moment and let these characters breathe, your viewer would lose interest. Netflix's Avatar opens with an earthbender no one knows, delivering a message no one has the context of, featuring a visually engaging but ultimately thematically meaningless fight scene that left me with nothing but vague emptiness and a sinking feeling that this show was not going to be a good adaptation. This is the coward's way to start your live-action Avatar: The Last Airbender remake. It fundamentally misunderstands the original cartoon. This new opening sacrifices character at the altar of plot and spectacle, an ill omen for the more egregious errors the adaptation will showcase later on in its run. Ultimately, this comes down to one core idea, one misplaced narrative throughline that can be traced to nearly every stumbling point Netflix Avatar makes along the road of adaptation. What the creatives behind Netflix's Avatar don't understand is that Avatar was never about the Avatar. Alright, I can already see the comments coming in. Aang is the Avatar and the show is about him. I'm gonna kill you. Grant me at least
35
minutes to justify that statement before making threats on my life. People often chalk up Netflix Avatar's failure as an adaptation to the sum total of minor and major changes strewn throughout its 8-episode run. Changes like Katara getting the waterbending scroll from Gran Gran instead of stealing it from the pirates are tallied and presented not as a collection of thematic elements that fail to adhere to the ethos of the original show, but merely as a set of modifications that are only bad because they are different from the original. If the critique of Netflix Avatar begins and ends there, you are giving the show too much credit. The faults of the Netflix adaptation are more rotten and fundamental than simply it happened differently in the cartoon. I don't have any huge issues with the various remixes and rearranging of plot details in Netflix Avatar. In reading some interviews with the creatives behind the show, I think they do a good enough job justifying some of the big choices. The issue, in my opinion, comes not from what they've changed, but how those changes fail to add up to a cohesive, thematically and narratively satisfying whole. It does this by foregoing character for plot. That's what I mean when I say Avatar was never about the Avatar. Yes, Aang is the Avatar and the show is about Aang, but Aang, the character, and the Avatar, the idea, are not the same thing. The Avatar is a symbol, a title, a plot device. Aang is a person. Avatar gives away the game within its own subtitle. This show is about The Last Airbender. It's about a 12-year-old boy named Aang who just so happens to be the Avatar. Despite the overarching fight against the Fire Nation, despite the deep lore about the nature of the Avatar and the spirit world, Avatar has always been a character-driven show, meaning the feelings, reactions, and growth of the show's characters always took precedent over plot and story. That does not mean the plot is bad or irrelevant, but that it is not the primary narrative goal behind the show. The air nomad genocide is important to the world building and plot, but the show primarily chooses to explore the genocide through the eyes and emotions of its last living survivor. Avatar as a work is more interested in Aang's feelings about being the last airbender rather than the fact that he is the last airbender. Avatar being character-driven is why it is right to start the show with Katara and Sokka's argument, and why the most critically acclaimed children's show of the last 20 years can end with a Deus Ex Machina and Aang getting Dark Knight Rises punch to get the Avatar state back, and it doesn't matter. 1. What they say versus what they show you. You may be wondering how, despite sharing roughly the same plot and characters, I can say one show is about the characters and the other isn't. Basically, it comes down to a core tenet we have to keep in mind when we analyze any kind of media. Just because a work says it's about something doesn't mean that it is. TV and film as art forms are not just visual delivery systems for expository dialogue. The Watchmen comic book is outright hostile to the idea of superheroes existing in the real world, and that's kind of the whole point. It does this through dialogue, yeah, but also through other creative methods like framing and costume design. Zack Snyder's Watchmen adaptation contains dialogue that critique the idea of superheroes, but how Snyder chooses to frame, shoot, and visualize his characters makes it overwhelmingly obvious that he thinks superheroes are fucking cool. It ends up forming this creative dissonance between what the work is saying and what it's actually showing us. And in my opinion, what the work is showing is infinitely more illuminating to the creative meaning behind the work than any dialogue spelling out its attempted themes. Netflix Avatar does have dialogue where Aang tells us he's just a lighthearted kid who likes to have fun with his friends, but rarely is the show actually interested in dramatizing that.
I like to play airball and eat banana cakes and goof off with my friends.
The choice to have two emotionally hollow fight scenes before we ever really see Aang doing anything that indicates who he is as a person gives away the show's narrative goals 20 minutes into the first episode. But the thing is, these changes don't exist in a vacuum. Netflix's team didn't just arbitrarily change up the original for shits and giggles or because they thought they could do a better version of Avatar, the latter accusation of which I often see leveled at this show and other adaptations. I personally think that's a lazy analysis and ignoring the larger context of the media environment that any given work exists within misses the forest for the trees. 2. How to adapt a work. Despite not liking the show, I am sympathetic to Netflix's creative team when it comes to the struggles of adaptation. A good adaptation has to both honor its source material while doing something different enough to justify its existence. But honoring the source material does not necessarily mean being faithful to the plot, characters, or story of the original work. A one-to-one adaptation often falls short because it both fails to bring anything new to the narrative while also inherently being worse than the original. An adaptation can, and often should, have different narrative, thematic, and plot goals than the original work. Going back to Watchmen, in my opinion, Damon Lindelof's HBO sequel series, though I have my problems with it, is infinitely closer to the thematic meaning of the original than Snyder's version. Lindelof's version is critical of the idea of superheroes existing in the real world. Things like its portrayal of Rorschach's extreme black and white morality being a springboard for fascism is much more in line with the original's intention with the character's ideology rather than Snyder's glorification of him. The 1962 film adaptation of To Kill a Mockingbird swaps its narrative focus around. Instead of primarily being a coming-of-age story that just so happens to feature elements of a courtroom drama, the film is a courtroom drama that just so happens to feature elements of a coming-of-age story. These two works serve as complements to each other while also retaining their own identity and distinct narrative aims despite sharing the majority of the same plot. Dune Part 2, real quick, spoilers for Dune Part 2. Dune Part 2 makes some significant changes to Chani's character, especially towards the end of the film. Instead of being a mostly passive concubine for Paul Atreides like she is in the novel, Chani becomes disillusioned with Paul's means and intentions as the film goes on. One of Frank Herbert's motivations for creating Dune Messiah was to emphasize and somewhat correct for the reaction some readers had of Paul Atreides and what Herbert wanted to say about charismatic leaders and Western imperialism. The team behind Dune Part 2 used Chani's growing skepticism of Paul to highlight these themes in a more explicit way than Herbert's original novel did. That is all to say, there are many different ways to go about adapting a work, and being accurate to the plot isn't inherently a requirement for that. So don't get me wrong, I do not want a one-to-one adaptation of Avatar. Live action and animation are two different mediums and necessarily require different approaches to storytelling. And if I am going to get fed the same story twice, I want them to have meaningful differences. So I am sympathetic to the plight of the Netflix Avatar team. How do you adapt this critically acclaimed work to a new medium while both honoring the source material and justifying its own existence? Netflix chose to do this by switching up its narrative focus. Instead of being a character-driven show like the original Avatar, Netflix Avatar chooses to shift most of its narrative weight on plot. In the abstract, this is not an inherently bad choice, but it is a bad choice when it comes to adapting Avatar: The Last Airbender specifically, because Avatar is its characters. The show's thematic and narrative weight is designed to maximize meaning through character, and an adaptation of Avatar that isn't interested in character kind of misses the whole point of the show. 3. Television has changed, and Netflix's content model sort of made it impossible to make a good adaptation of Avatar. By nature of how these creative projects work within the constraints of deadline capitalism, this narrative choice to focus on plot over character was likely a big picture decision made relatively early on in Netflix Avatar's production. The rearranging of the original show's plot beats in the adaptation are not only to make it distinct from the original, but are necessary considering Netflix's narrative goals. There's also an inherent difference in presentation and delivery of the narrative between the original cartoon and the Netflix adaptation. Avatar was episodic, but the Netflix adaptation is serialized. Episodic story structure would be something like Buffy or Star Trek. Self-contained stories with overarching themes and characters, but in theory, any episode could be enjoyed as a singular work disconnected from the larger show. A serialized show would be something like Breaking Bad or The Sopranos, with episodes that build off each other and play more like a 10-hour movie. Now, I'm not saying one of those storytelling methods are inherently better than the other, but these structures do produce different outcomes in the overall feel of the show. Something like Breaking Bad wouldn't work episodically because a huge part of the show's persona comes from the gradual buildup of tension as Walt entrenches himself deeper and deeper into the criminal world. An episode where the main plot stops and Walt and Jesse go on a class field trip to a zoo and face a villain of the week completely disconnected from the main arc of the season would likely ruin the show's pacing. I mean, the closest thing Breaking Bad has to an episode like that is widely regarded as the worst in the entire show's run for a reason. But on the other end, a show like Buffy requires episodic story structure to get the work's narrative aims across. Episodic story structure generally gives more breathing room for character moments because we're not in a constant race toward a season-long plot goal, and the variety of stories gives us more opportunities to see characters react to a number of different scenarios and situations. There are huge, notable, and iconic parts of the original Avatar that are functionally the Nickelodeon equivalent of a hangout film. Inherently, the serialized Netflix version can't spend as much time letting the characters be the characters without driving the plot forward. Again, that choice to shift away from episodic story structure is less of a problem with this specific adaptation and really a consequence of the specific media environment that Netflix Avatar exists within. For a variety of reasons, mostly involving money and C-suite overreach, episodic story structure just doesn't really happen anymore outside of big network television like Law & Order. There is also the whole Netflix slop factor that can't be ignored in any examination of this series. Things like this Hollywood Reporter interview with Justine Bateman where she talks about Netflix execs wanting their media to be background noise, and this N+1 article where they talk about how Netflix wants characters to announce what they're doing, paint a picture of a company who is not interested in making good television, but rather a peripheral visual mosaic that comforts you while scrolling through TikTok. Understanding the media apparatus around any given work is valuable as a consumer because I think it's important to know where to direct your anger. If I had to bet on it, I'd wager that what caused the departure of the original Avatar creators from the remake was this apparatus that favors passive watching over good art, rather than any disagreements they may have had with the individuals working on the show. I don't mean to condescend or justify the Netflix team's fumbling of the ball, but the media environment that they exist in made that ball more slippery than it would have been 20 years ago when the original Avatar came out. Netflix's decision to shift the narrative focus on plot and the restrictions that come with serializing an episodic work functionally made it impossible to open Netflix Avatar the same way as the cartoon. I would consider Avatar's first 2 episodes intrinsically linked. You can't have one without the other. Even so, within the roughly 40-minute runtime, there are maybe 2 big sequences that push the plot forward after Katara and Sokka find Aang: Zuko's invasion of the Water Village and Aang's escape from Zuko's ship. Other than that, the vast majority of Avatar's opening episodes are all character-driven. This put Netflix's Avatar team in a weird position creatively. They want to have spectacle, but so much of these 2 scenes are built up by knowing the characters. We can't just skip to them. But we need some action, so irrelevant Earthbender opening. But this change presents a problem, a big one, because if I could sum up Book 1 of Avatar into one thematic thesis, one core idea that runs throughout the entire show but has a particular emphasis in the first season, it would be this. 4. Book 1, Water, is about what war does to children. Being the Avatar alienates Aang from his peers. Katara and Sokka are forced into leadership roles within their community despite being teenagers. Zuko is banished from his home by refusing to accept the morality of collateral damage. The invasion of the Southern Water Tribe at the beginning of the season is mirrored with the invasion of the Northern Water Tribe at the end of the season. While Katara, Sokka, and Aang are forced into conflict against their will at the beginning, in the end, they have become radicalized and have accepted the violence they must partake in to combat the Fire Nation's invasion. Katara, Sokka, and especially Aang do not want to be violent. But the Fire Nation's war has given them no choice, and the collective arc over the first season is accepting that fact. Being children in a war zone has divested them of the means to act out on their own inherent morality. This core theme is reflected in the opening of the show that I can't fucking stop talking about. Typical sibling bickering is stopped when Sokka and Katara are forced to deal with the repercussions of the Fire Nation's war. And nothing about the opening of Netflix Avatar touches on this theme at all. Netflix Avatar is more interested in the conflict itself, isolated from the context in which it exists and how the show's characters react to it. And by the time we actually get introduced to Aang, the show feels like it's examining him out of obligation rather than interest. The 2 most important things that make up Aang as a character that any adaptation of this work should attempt to get across as clearly and concisely early on are that 1, he has power that goes well beyond what those around him can understand, And 2, he's an actual 12-year-old who just wants to do normal 12-year-old things. The original pretty successfully gets these 2 points out right off the bat without a word of shoddy exposition. Aang's avatar state lets out a giant beam of light, he glows, and overall gives the viewer a hint that this person might be special. And then the first thing he does when Katara wakes him up is to ask her to go penguin sledding with him. The 2 most important things we need to know about Aang are here, and both done narratively seamlessly. Netflix Avatar gives us 2 dialogue-heavy, awkward exposition scenes. One where the senior monks just outright tell us what Aang's core character conflict is going to be over the entire series.
But there's much he still needs to learn about responsibility, expectations, sacrifice. Most of all, he needs to know who he is.
And another where Aang monologues to Appa that he's just a kid who wants to have fun.
I don't want the responsibility. I'm scared of my power. I'm scared of being alone.
Aang's characterization is put on the back burner, haphazardly delivered to us as quickly as possible to get it out of the way for another action sequence. Again, the show is saying one thing while showing us something else that gives away the game about what it is really prioritizing. Because Netflix Avatar isn't interested in what being the Avatar means to a child, it fumbles the ball in such a severe way that fundamentally undermines everything that comes after it. Its shoddy underlying structure can't hold the weight of all that comes after it because it only shows a glancing interest in what war does to children. It's about war, which just so happens to have children fighting it. 5. The Netflix team saw a shadow and thought it was the real thing. You know, there's another thing that bothered me about Netflix Avatar's opening that I couldn't quite quantify until I watched Big Joel's 7-hour autopsy of the show. After the whole horrible earthbender scene, we get the typical Avatar long ago opening from the original show, except something about it feels hollow. And I couldn't quite figure it out until Big Joel brought up the fact that this opening is now being delivered by Avatar Kyoshi instead of Katara. The original opening was exposition, yeah, but it was also about character. We learn about Katara and about the reality that people like her live in. Katara has grown up in a world where she, despite being a child, does not have the luxury to be politically indifferent. She grew up in a world where war and conflict are taken for granted. Katara knows the Avatar disappeared, she knows the airbenders were genocided, and is constantly faced with the reality of what the war has done and is doing to her people. Kyoshi's opening is just exposition, and sort of needless exposition considering how Netflix Avatar covered how the war started, how the reincarnation cycle works, and the fact that the Avatar disappeared. It feels like it's there because that's what the original show did without really understanding the narrative purpose that opening served. There are moments like that throughout the entire season. So many moments that touch on or glance by these core themes while also not really getting them. In episode 3, the Netflix team has decided to mash together 3 different episodes from the original show: The King of Omashu, Jet, and the Northern Air Temple. This mashup actually works, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Season 1 showrunner Albert Kim constantly used it as an example of changes made by the team in interviews. You know, good job guys, go brag about it. Having Jet and Sai in the same episode is thematically coherent. We see 2 potential reactions oppressed people have in relation to their oppressors. Jet has become an extremist, and Sai has begun working with his oppressors as a means to gain safety for his family. Oppressed people, more often than not, have imperfect reactions to their oppression. To expect people who have been subjugated, genocided, and marginalized to come out of that suffering with some kind of enlightened perspective is to ignore the quantifiable and studied psychological damage this kind of oppression does to people. That's a huge part of the tragedy behind Jet and Sai. They're not bad people. Despite how we may disagree with their means, both their actions can be traced logically back to the damage, both psychologically and physically, the Fire Nation has done to them and their people. Sai's trauma led him to sell his soul to try and prevent his son from experiencing more horror. Jet's trauma led him to adopt an ends justify the means philosophy because he's witnessed firsthand the atrocities the Fire Nation have committed and will continue to commit. Despite making what I think is a good thematic choice by including these two storylines together, Netflix Avatar's disinterest in character causes both to miss the mark, in particular with its portrayal of Jet. 6. They fucked up Jet. Jet, in the original, was always a morally gray character. Here, Jet is characterized as being an outright bad guy, and just like the Firebenders. Aw, come on, X, there's more nuance than that. The show isn't saying that Jet is a bad guy and just like the Firebenders. No, it's actually literally saying that.
You are the bad guy. You're fighting because of hate, just like the Firebenders.
Despite being a kid's show, the original Avatar never let its morality be as simple as the Netflix version. Avatar's Jet is a tragic character, a child who has been radicalized by his material conditions and forced into extremism. Yet, the show and its characters have a level of nuanced understanding of him. Katara's frustration towards Jet comes from her relating to him and seeing where, in her mind, Jet went wrong. Even at the end of the episode, Katara doesn't explicitly demonize Jet, and likewise, the audience leaves the episode not necessarily with a Jet was a bad guy mindset. In the cartoon, a Fire Nation garrison has taken over a small Earth Kingdom village. Jet's plan was to eliminate the garrison by sacrificing the entire village in an explosion. Now, I just want to make something clear here. I don't buy into the moral justification of collateral damage. In my opinion, it is wrong every time. I'm no Jet apologist. I believe his plan is abhorrent, but it is coherent strategically. He has a concrete goal, eliminate the garrison, and his plan, even though it's horrible, will achieve that goal. The entire history of human conflict is riddled with these kinds of plans, attacks that justify collateral damage in the name of some kind of larger strategic goal. Jet's plan being coherent speaks to a larger truth about war, that the justifications for evil acts are often rooted in things that go beyond, we're evil and we want to kill innocent people. Again, that does not make these actions morally right, but it does ground them in the socio-political conditions that lead to this kind of violence. In choosing to portray Jet this way, the creatives behind Avatar are respecting their audience, trusting that they could portray a nuanced portrait of a radicalized teenager that we could both condemn and sympathize with. In Netflix Avatar, Jet's plan makes no sense. He plants a bomb on Sai that he intends to detonate when the machinist holds council with King Bumi. Why?
This is our chance to burn out this city's diseased heart.
Incoherent and morally simple. This is not a misguided plan formed by a radicalized teenager attempting to fight back against his oppressors and losing his morality in the process. This is a fucking Nazi. Avatar leaves some questions up in the air about Jet's morality with the purpose of leaving the audience with a question. Is Jet the same as the Fire Nation? In my opinion, the answer is no, but rather than outright tell us that, the show leaves enough narrative breadcrumbs and respects the audience enough to let us come to that conclusion ourselves. In my reading of Netflix Avatar, the creatives behind the show seemed uncomfortable with having a more nuanced portrayal of Jet. Instead of showing us Jet, the child forced into extremism by being born into a violent conflict, and the moral nuance that is required by that kind of examination, Netflix Avatar wants to show us a centrist caricature of the kind of extremism that these conflicts create. It wants to tell us that the fascism of the Fire Nation and the radicalization of Jet are the same thing, when in both the real world and the original cartoon, they simply aren't. Netflix Avatar both misunderstands Jet on a fundamental level and disrespects the audience so much that they gotta give us an explicit answer.
You are the bad guy.
This, I believe, is another repercussion of something I get the sense that the creative team behind Netflix Avatar was aiming for. 7. I don't think they wanted this to be thought of as a kid's show. Yes, the original Avatar features rich and dark moments, themes, and ideas. Yes, I like and appreciate the show much more as an adult than I did as a kid. But Avatar is, unquestionably, a children's show. It's accessible and lighthearted enough for children while not compromising on its core themes and values. This is something I believe is possible because the leads are children. We see the world through their eyes, and kids, even kids who grow up in a war zone, will still try to be kids. I get the sense that the Netflix Avatar team was less interested in making a faithful adaptation of a children's show and more interested in making the next Game of Thrones. And what do you know, Albert Kim literally said that. Weirdly enough, this choice of focusing more on the conflict and less about the children makes the show feel way more immature than the original ever did.
Fire Lord Ozai must die tonight!
It's this rejection of letting us see the world through these characters, a fear that the show's themes won't come through naturally that, ironically, ends up diluting them. 8. They ruined my favorite line from the original. Lack of interest in character, unwillingness to let the themes and morality of the show speak for itself, afraid of letting the children be children. 3 of Netflix Avatar's cardinal sins. I want to emphasize that because these choices are perhaps best exemplified by one moment in episode 6. One moment that contains some of the most meaning and thematic richness in the original Avatar that ends up falling flat on its face because of the choices made by the Netflix team. This one is, largely, an adaptation of episode 13 of the original cartoon, The Blue Spirit. In the original episode, we see Aang and Zuko work together for the first time. They escape, Zuko gets knocked unconscious, Aang finds out who the Blue Spirit is, and even though he hesitates, he ends up saving Zuko and waits for him to wake up. Aang tells a story about his friend Kuzan, who is part of the Fire Nation. He then asks Zuko a question which, depending on the day, may be one of the most profound things I've ever heard in any kind of media.
If we knew each other back then, do you think we could have been friends too?
And this is it. If there was one line that can sum up what the first book of Avatar is about, it's here. Because of this arbitrary conflict, because of the arbitrary geographical lines drawn between nations, and because these two characters happen to be born on opposite ends of those arbitrary geographical lines, these two children are enemies. It speaks to the meaninglessness of war, of nations, of states, how these man-made concepts become so embedded in the human psyche that they feel objective and real, how these concepts end up getting in the way of actual truth. The simple fact of the matter is that Aang and Zuko would have been friends if it wasn't for the war. We know this because they ended up being friends despite the war. How many connections have any of us missed out on because of the specific circumstances of our lives in any given moment? We are nothing but the amalgamation of every experience we've ever had, distilled and interpreted through a fleeting temperamental state we call the present. How many friends have any of us missed out on because our present and their present didn't line up in the moment we had? Yeah, I got all that out of one line. One line that didn't need to be anything more than what it was. Netflix Avatar does include this moment, but it's preceded by an entire extra scene of Aang and Zuko having similar clunky expository and pseudo-philosophical conversations around this idea that just completely rob the line of the original's emotional weight.
Try to help.
I don't need your help.
Those guys out there. Fire Nation.
Yes.
So they're on your side. Why are you fighting them?
They're not on my side.
That's what you want? To be the next Fire Lord?
Yes. Of course, it's what everyone expects of me.
Maybe you don't have to be like the other firebenders. Maybe you could be better than them. So you don't have to be like them. You can show some compassion.
By the time Aang actually says the line, it just doesn't mean anything. There was an ambiguity to Aang and Zuko's relationship at this point in the original show. They had never really spoken to each other outside of trading lines while literally fighting. But stripped of his own preconceived notions of who Zuko is, Aang has an effortless charisma and magnetism to him. They work well together. This leads Aang to question the nature of their entire relationship. But in the Netflix version, Aang and Zuko wax philosophical at each other so much that the ambiguity of their relationship that exists in the original just isn't here. In trying to expand on the original thematic meaning of this line, the creatives behind Netflix Avatar have just undermined it. And the scene serves as a paragon of Netflix Avatar's defining sin. 9. It can't leave well enough alone. Aang's questioning of the nature of his and Zuko's relationship can't just be a single line. The air nomad genocide can't be implied. It has to be explicit, with cool fights riddled with the CGI of an underpaid and overworked VFX studio. Aang can't just be a kid trying to be a kid. He and every other character has to incessantly spew philosophical nothings about the nature of his role as the Avatar. In trying to appeal to an adult audience by making explicit the implicit, Netflix Avatar has watered down the original's theme so much that the show is way more childish than the original, even at its most goofy. Netflix Avatar is afraid of being what it is, and its insecurity is so palpable, so visceral, that even moments pulled directly from the original series land like that one smelly kid who tried doing the air scooter. 10. Netflix forgot about one thing. The team behind Netflix's Avatar wanted to make Game of Thrones. They wanted to expand on the original's themes while simultaneously misunderstanding them and undermining their audience's ability to understand them. It wanted to talk about the war, the nature of the Avatar and its place in the world, the political figures pushing their agendas, but not through the lens of the children that are experiencing the conflict. In trying to explore and expand on this narrative and these themes, Netflix Avatar has failed. It forgoes character in favor of exposition and spectacle, all because the creative team behind the project forgot about one core truth. Avatar was never about the Avatar.